Hello, everybody. It is me, Professor Keegan, and I am well enough to make a narrated video lecture for you, on top of some slides I prepared for the content we missed yesterday. I must apologize for not being well enough to actually hold class. I was really excited to watch this film with you, but I'm hopeful that you were able to make use of the streaming link to watch it in a quiet and dark environment because it's a very gorgeous and yet very subtle, in many ways, film that has a lot to say about representation and sensation. And I'm going to present material today about why treating this film as a melodrama is useful. Um, for what it's worth, I'm an expert on melodrama. My dissertation was on the queer body and its use in popular melodrama in a North American context. And we are moving over to Europe and France, particularly with this film, but I think a lot of what it's doing is in the same vein. So melodrama has been a genre through which we have gotten quite a number of queer expressions. Um, and you'll notice that it's also a category you can take up in your project for this class if you get really interested in melodrama. There are a number of other films I've listed that operate in the same way. So, what I'll do is talk through a bit of what makes a melodrama a melodrama. I'll talk a little bit about the reading, and then, should you choose to write about this film this week, I have some prompts for you since we can't have discussion. Okay, so first of all, what is melodrama? Melodrama is much larger than just a genre. It really is an aesthetic mode that undergirds a lot of popular performed art in a range of different continental contexts, even. Um, so we're all very familiar with it and how it works. It's the same filmic language that we see in sports movies, that we see in action films, that we see in many romances, right? In which feeling drives everything. Um, and it's combined with the use of the body, particularly gesture, um, along with music to convey emotional truth. And this is a style or an aesthetic mode that comes out of really the turn of the late 18th century with the advent of democratic societies in which art began to be about everyday people and their situations. And melodrama is about producing importance, producing the emotional importance of life, everyday people's lives, through these kind of grand scales of emotion. Um, it comes again from theater, particularly a combination of stage musicals and opera, beginning as a set of theatrical practices that got translated into early silent film via a shared performance economy that we see in the gestural repertoire of early silent film acting. So remember, a lot of people who acted in early silent film came from the stage, and would have used the same gestural system to convey emotion, especially prior to the invention of film dialogue, like recorded film dialogue. The body had to communicate emotion using these sort of standard gestures. And so what I have here is a small piece of the Delsart system of expression, which was a very elaborate system of gestural language used by actors that was popularized and typified in the mid to late 1800s. So a lot of stage actors use this very stagey gestural kind of movement that then showed up in silent film, which you might kind of be thinking about, oh, why does silent film seem so stagey? It's because of how actors were communicating emotion through body position, right down to how hands moved on camera. Um, so, melodrama is broader than just genre melodrama, which we're going to talk about, right? But it does undergird all filmic language as a much more broad, popular mode. Television also uses melodramatic signification and structure, right? And it really informs our expectations of how film works as a representational language and its purposes, which is to tell stories not only of big, high, important people, right? but of everyday contexts that are still meaningful. How do you produce meaning out of popular or everyday life? Excuse me, I'm still a little stuffed up. Um, the authors we read noted that melodrama is actually a global mode. So, much like the musical, it's a mode that we see having unique expressions across several continents, most notably South America, particularly Mexico, and also Asia, particularly India, right? Have their own melodramatic traditions, which are somewhat separate from what we're discussing in class. And you know, films labeled genre melodrama are films that give special, unique weight to the expressive properties of this mode. And so that's what we're going to talk about in class today. Video class is like, what does film genre melodrama do? And how does it pick up these properties that are much more widely shared and turn them into genre? Okay. So, as with any week in class, I'm going to give you a checklist. And again, keep in mind, as Altman says, genres only exist because we continue to believe in them. We continue to believe that this package of properties expresses something important about the human condition. So they're always changing, and they achieve historical significance in certain periods based on what they help us make sense of in the world. So, these properties were typified really in the 1940s and 50s with the advent and height of the classical women's picture. Keep in mind that during World War II, a lot of popular cinemas or state cinemas started making movies for women because all the men were fighting in World War II, right? So a lot of genre melodramatic history gets established in a classical cycle during this period when the audiences were suddenly mostly female. Okay, so we do think of it as a traditionally feminine film genre. Um, and as a feminine genre, it's interested in the private sphere rather than the public world of men. So melodrama often depicts an entirely personalized or private world in which problems are communicated and worked through via emotion, via argumentation, or even plot mechanics. Like the plot is secondary to the emotional experience that the text is trying to produce for us. Um, and a really important feature of genre melodrama is the use of dramatic, aesthetic, or emotional excess, right? Over the top things to indicate the repressive nature of social convention or an imposed political order. So you get this sense of repression and restriction that then from inside of that restriction bursts this excess. And I mean, in the case of Portrait on a Lady of a Lady on Fire, I mean, we're dealing with women who are wearing very restrictive clothing, right? So even thinking about their clothing and the importance of the clothes in the portraits that are also a frame in which things are placed and controlled, the way painting and clothing work together to communicate repression and something that needs to be released, right? Is foundational to how melodrama kind of treats this idea of excess in the face of repression. Um, the main characters in a melodrama are usually fated to experience victimization or loss due to circumstances outside of their control. So, melodramas are not usually about liberation or resistance. They're about loss, tragedy, fate, and bittersweet, a kind of bittersweetness about what is possible and yet hasn't been able to be lived. This tension between the possible and impossible is really important in a melodrama. Temporality is usually in a too late or if only mode, right? So things happen too late or at the wrong time, often, and we often begin at the end, just like we do in this film. We use flashback, right? Meaning we begin at the end so that we understand already when we go to the beginning of the film, which is the beginning of the timeline of the film, right? We understand already that it's too late because we know that these women don't end up together, right? So the too lateness here is used to produce this feeling of pathos or if onlyness, this empathy we have for the characters, of missed connection, of like fated to never really be, right? These kinds of temporal modalities. Um, Very high emphasis on music and bodily movement to convey emotional truth versus what people say. People may say one thing because of social propriety or expectation in a melodrama, but their bodies tell us a different story. And often the music provides other context, right? The music tells us something else is possible. It helps convey the emotions that are going on that the characters can't express verbally. So again, repression and emotion and music all go together here and surround the body. And the body has to kind of perform according to social convention, but also indicate the possibility of more expression that can't actually be engaged in. Often, objects in the mise en scène are symbolic, meaning they symbolize the plight of the characters in some way, often in ways the characters don't even understand, right? And so we could think here about not only the use of the blank canvas as an object in the frame, unpainted, waiting to be filled up with something, right? But also all of the paintings of women that are commissioned by wealthy men who own those women, right? The title of the film is Portrait of a Lady on Fire, right? And there are so many paintings of women whose names we don't know historically that are just called Portrait of a Young Girl or Portrait of a Lady that were painted by men, right? So these paintings and the work they do in the mise en scène to represent a history, a set of conditions of power, a patriarchal system, right? And the trap, the kind of frame in which women get placed, all of that is taking place through simply putting portraits on walls, right? Um, Melodramas focus on using tragedy to generate pathos, meaning a strong feeling of empathy for unjustified suffering. We feel for the characters. We empathize with their unjust suffering and the unfairness of their situation in a melodrama. The ultimate goal of a melodrama is to produce a sweeping affective response to the impossibility of living an emotional truth, right? Like, if in a musical it's about the achievement of this grand feeling, and being able to join in via dance and song. In a melodrama, a genre melodrama, it's about not being able to do so. To know that it's right over there, but I won't be able to participate. I will never be able to live what I feel. Um, it's about that dissonance between possibility and impossibility. And film scholar Jonathan Goldberg, who's an expert in melodrama, has called genre melodrama what he calls the aesthetics of impossibility, right? And I think that's a really good way to think about melodrama, is that it aestheticizes what is rendered impossible by the social conventions of its world. Okay? So that's kind of the standard palette that a genre melodrama is using. What I want to do now is talk a bit about standard examples. So, you may know some of these films, whether from the classical cycle, right? Mildred Pierce or All That Heaven Allows are really, really famous Hollywood melodramas. You may also have seen Titanic, which is a really good example of a modern melodrama where we know already it's using history to show us the fatedness, right? We know the boat's going to sink because we're here in our current time period and we already know the tragic context, right? So, in that sense, the sort of impossibility of the plot is always already in motion because we know the boat's going to sink, right? And Crash also, not a great, not all melodramas are good, right? Some are very manipulative or very ham-handed or ham-fisted, I guess you'd say, in their emotional technology that they're using. But the way in which melodrama has been used in an American context to think through like racial inequity is another long history we could get into. And one of the authors of our first article, Linda Williams, has written a lot about race melodrama. So that's something to kind of bookmark mentally. That melodramas often attack social issues, are often about social issues and problems of injustice or inequality. Okay. So I want to talk a bit about Gledhill and Williams. Both of them are very well-regarded film scholars who've written a lot about melodrama. And they're making a really broad case here for melodrama as much larger than any genre, right? Um, and they get at some formal properties of the melodrama that I think are useful to our analysis because I think a lot of people would actually not think of Portrait of a Lady on Fire as a melodrama. And I'm kind of arguing that it is, and that it's the most instructive genre to place the film in for various reasons that I'll get into. Um, but Gledhill and Williams are writing this piece to challenge neat definitions of melodrama as limited only to like one period of time or one culture or as the women's picture, right? Writing that the relevant components of a melodrama are less important than how it uses excess to open up the drama, right? That excess is there in a melodrama to reveal a larger moral or political scale for the things we're watching, right? We're watching the personal lives of these people, and excess is there to help us understand their historical or political significance in a larger framework, right? So that's certainly the case with Portrait of a Lady on Fire, where the use of kind of painting, um, along with other components of the film, indicate, yeah, sure, we're in this very remote, small place, but the actual historical context is sweeping and vast, right? That these are sweeping, vast themes playing out in a small place. They write that melodrama is characterized by a belief in the quote, power and value of feeling that gives ordinary lives intense meaning, right? And so you can see how melodrama comes along with the advent of democracy as a way of thinking through the importance of everyday lives, that everyday lives still have intense emotional importance. And we need a genre that helps us understand, or a mode that helps us understand or produce empathy for everyday life, right? Rather than just caring about what the elites are doing. Melodrama is fundamentally interested in sensation and aesthetic spectacle, right? Sensation, feeling, um, as well as arresting imagery. Um, so they argue that the plot or the moral conflict in through which a plot is told in a melodrama is only a framework through which it produces the overpowering feelings and images. And again, we have a film here that has literally has a frame, right? The frame does so much work in this film to produce a compressed space in which things then happen. Or we're on the secluded island, right, where nobody is. It's a very compressed, small social space, very intimate. How does that setting then allow for these huge feelings to emerge, right? These intricate, intimate sensations the film gives us are only possible because of this compressed plot that we're caught in. While there are no fixed moral values the melodrama enforces, it uses contrasts between truth and artifice. And keep in mind that here we are painting women as men want to see them, right? Rather than women as they are, right? So the tension between representation and truth here is an active component of the film, as well as power and helplessness, right? These women don't have a lot of control over what happens to them. Men say what is to happen, and it happens. So the framework of their power is limited, but what do they do with it, right? Um, these contrasts are used to produce what Gledhill and Williams called a struggle for a felt sense of justice. Water. Characters' voices are often rendered mute, and I mean here, sometimes people can't say what they really feel, right? Because of social propriety or convention or rule. Um, so they often don't say what they feel, or they have limited power to express themselves, right? They're rendered mute due to unjust circumstances that are then given expression via displacement into forms of aesthetic or sonic excess. So the swelling music, the bright colors, the sensational feelings, right, are all there to stand in for things that can't be verbally expressed in certain situations. And they write, for melodrama's pathos, remember that intense empathy, to work, we must recognize the situation of its characters as feeling real versus plausible, right? A melodrama is not very frequently plausible, meaning it doesn't represent things that are likely to happen to anybody, right? Usually the events are quite unusual, quite illogical, quite unique. But the work of the film is to make them feel real anyway, right? So the situation has to feel real, and therefore melodramas prioritize verisimilitude, which is the presentation of a believable world, versus simply a plausible plot. And that is very crucial to its function. I mean, this film is not about something highly plausible, right? It is about a very implausible situation. And yet, the world is rendered in such verisimilitudic detail for us. We feel like we're there, right? The emotional stakes capture us as real. We get invested, right? Because the film is giving us an internally consistent, emotionally believable world, even though it's not very logically plausible. Okay, so that's Gledhill and Williams. And then quickly, I wanted to go to Kaminsky. Every class, I give you some writing on the film that we're watching to kind of prompt your thinking and to see how another scholar has approached it, right? And I wanted to note that the reading intro team this week, first of all, did a great job with what is some kind of difficult, I think, difficult writing on melodrama. But they almost all focused on this one quote from Kaminsky as well, which I wanted to read to you. Um, and this is the quote. The queerest thing about Portrait of a Lady on Fire is the way it invites the viewer to experience this ultimately unchoosable, socially unrecognizable passion between women by allowing them to invent it for themselves. I think this quote stands out not only because it says, okay, this is the queerest thing about the film. You might actually disagree. That's an argument Kaminsky is making. But that it because it pushes things up against each other that the film is illustrating its pathos through, right? Queerness being unchoosable, right? This film is about something that can't happen. And like one of the challenges of thinking about melodrama is how it makes the tragedy of unchoosability meaningful, right? Moving, relatable, right? So, um, when we're talking about unchoosability and lack of social recognition for something, we're talking about there's no model for what these two characters are doing. And this is a film about modeling. It's a film about posing to be painted, right? So how does all the use of modeling in the film point to the lack of a model for something else that they're trying to figure out together, this relationship, this desire for each other? So yeah, the lack of a model may be the queerest thing about the film. However, it is the unchoosability, this word that Kaminsky uses, that that model, this desire cannot actually be chosen. It can't be lived long term, right? This relationship can't happen, right? It is the unchoosability of the desire as a social possibility that makes the film melodramatic, that produces that if only feeling. And we know from the very beginning that it's not a relationship that lasts, right? It's not a relationship that can become real according to the social order the women are living in. And yet, right? And yet it was worth it, right? Um, and so, yes, it's the queerest thing, excuse me, and that makes the film queer, but it's also presenting this unchoosability as a very sort of conventionally melodramatic genre component of the film. So what I mean by this, and I think what Kaminsky is pointing to, is that the film is moving. It moves us as viewers, specifically because they can't actually be together. Like that's an important component of the film. A lot of people would say, "Oh, well, this film would be so much happier if they could run off together." And that's not the point of a melodrama. The point is to move us through what can't happen versus what does, or to move us through what does happen despite its ultimate impossibility, right? Even as a written down history, the only evidence of this relationship is that little number painted in the corner of a book that's painted, right? That's the only trace that this actually happened. So the impossibility produces this grand feeling, right, in us, and the truth of the film is deepened specifically due to the pathos produced by the unpossessible passion that women have for each other. This would be a very different film if they stayed together. And it would ultimately maybe be a less queer film because the film is about the structures that produce the impossibility to begin with and how the dominant models for relationships um, don't produce any way for this relationship to actually be recorded or lived. So, in a film about the visual and marital capture of women by men, usually like remember, she's being painted so that the man can see what his like arranged wife looks like before he shows up, right? Or I guess she's going to be shipped to him, right? Like any object, right? So in a film about this capture via painting and marriage of women by men, the text produces a queer relation of longing but not possessing, right? For which there is no model as an alternative way of desiring somebody. Desiring but not possessing. Longing for but not having, right? And you could say that's the unchoosability of possession produces this queerness in the text. At least I think so. So, some things to think about since we can't discuss in real time, right? Some things to think about, like how does the film queer the formal properties of melodramatic structure? Because remember, this is a class on queer uses of genre. So, genre does certain things, has historically established certain patterns for creating meaning, but how do queer creators then pick those up and use them to produce different things, right? Um, So, how is this film queering those things and using them to point to different kinds of issues or problems, right? Um, what role does portraiture play in the film's commentary on oppressive social roles, visual capture, and heteropatriarchy? Um, there's a play on words in this title, whether it's in French or English, right? Portrait of a lady on fire. What's on fire? Is the portrait on fire or is the lady on fire? Right? There's a tension there. And I'd like you to think about the role of fire and excess, right, in this film. Like what does the fire represent? Um, and what is on fire is an interesting question. How is queer excess produced and where is it sensed or seen? And notably, in a film that I'm saying is using melodramatic conventions in a queer way, there's hardly any music in this film, right? And when it does show up, it is incredibly overwhelming. So what are the effects of the absence and presence of music in different spaces and places? And what does this very limited yet very powerful use of music achieve? Because there are two pieces of music in the film. One is a kind of folk song that gets sung at one point, and the other is, I believe, the summer movement of Vivaldi's The Four Seasons, which is played first on a harpsichord and later by an orchestra. Same exact piece of music, right? What is that doing and what does it produce for us in a film that if it is melodramatic in form, we would expect a lot more music, right? Um, yeah, something to think about. Is there a sort of queer use of music here? And then If so, how is it queering our expectations around music informing us about emotion? And that's all I have for you. So keep in mind, same old pattern for class. I'll put some readings up for next week soon. I will announce the reading team on this coming Wednesday for our next film, which is we're going to be doing romance. And keep in mind, not all melodramas are romances, right? This one happens to be. And not all romances are melodramatic in form either. So just be aware that these are close to each other thematically in some ways, but not the same. Um, and if you want to write about Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which I hope a few of you do, even though we didn't get to meet, the journal sub window closes Sunday night. I'm very curious to see what you think of this. So thank you very much. I'm going to leave it there before I lose my voice. Okay, bye.